They said it's impossible, but Chinese naval vessels arrived in Burkina Faso, a country with no coastline, no port. How could it build a navy? But they did not see our spirit. I speak now not just as a president, but as a soldier and as military captain. I promise to my homeland, we will rise from the ground they called barren. This is where their misunderstanding begins. NATO thought they could isolate us. Not symbolically, not on paper. Actually arrived, operational, deployed, ready. And NATO is in complete shock. Let me show you exactly how we did this, because what sounds impossible is actually a blueprint. A blueprint that any African nation can follow. A blueprint that proves we don't need their permission to defend ourselves. I'm holding a document right now. It's called the Trans-Sahel Maritime Access Agreement, signed by 4 nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Benin, ratified few months ago. Implemented in stages over the past year, operational as of 72 hours ago. This agreement creates something unprecedented, a sovereign maritime corridor. From the port of Cotonou in Benin, through secured territory in each signatory nation, all the way to our newly constructed naval facility 23 kilometers outside Ouagadougou. Not just a road or just a trade route, a militarily protected corridor with full sovereign rights under international law. A pathway that allows naval capabilities to reach landlocked nations through a combination of river systems, newly constructed canals, reinforced rail lines, and specialized overland transport. The engineering specifications are public. Anyone can verify them. The Weme River system, widened and deepened to accommodate shallow draft vessels. The Niger River tributaries, secured and monitored. 3 new canal sections totaling 47 kilometers, connecting natural waterways. Rail infrastructure upgraded to military-grade standards for transporting modular naval components. Total construction time, 14 months. Total cost, $800 million. Funded entirely by African nations and Chinese development loans with no policy conditions attached. No requirements to change our laws, no demands to alter our values, no surveillance equipment hidden in the infrastructure. Just business, real partnership, mutual benefit. And it works. 3 days ago, the first delivery arrived. I was there. I watched it happen. I saw what they said was impossible become undeniably real. Type 022 missile boats, modular design, transported in sections via our corridor, assembled on-site by joint Burkina Faso Chinese engineering teams, fully operational within 18 hours of arrival. 4 vessels currently, 8 more scheduled for delivery over the next 6 months, each equipped with anti-ship missiles, close-in weapon systems, and advanced radar, each crewed by Burkina Faso naval personnel trained over the past year in China and in our own facility. Yes, Burkina Faso naval personnel. We have a navy now. A landlocked country has a functioning navy, with trained sailors, with operational vessels, with defensive capabilities that didn't exist 2 years ago. The facility itself is extraordinary, not because it's the most advanced in the world, but because it exists at all, because we built it, because it's ours. Naval Operations Center Ouagadougou, that's the official designation, constructed on a 12-hectare site. Includes vessel maintenance facilities, crew quarters, command and control infrastructure, training simulators, and secure communications independent of Western satellites. The legal framework is airtight. I made sure of that, because I knew they would challenge it. I knew they would claim it violates some international norm or threatens regional stability or breaks some rule they invented to maintain their monopoly. So we documented everything. The agreement is registered with the African Union. It's filed with the United Nations under Article 51 of the UN Charter, which explicitly recognizes the right of nations to collective self-defense. It complies with all relevant maritime law, even though we're landlocked, because the corridor creates de facto maritime access under sovereign control. Every legal expert we consulted confirmed it. This is legitimate. This is lawful. This is our right. And there's nothing they can do to stop it legally. So they're trying everything else. The phone calls started within hours. I'm not exaggerating. Within hours of the first vessels becoming operational, my office was flooded with requests for urgent meetings. The French ambassador arrived first. He didn't even wait for a scheduled appointment. He showed up at my office, demanded to see me immediately, barely containing his alarm. I kept him waiting. Not to be petty, but to make a point. For decades, African leaders waited for Western diplomats, waited for their approval, waited for their permission, waited for their aid. Now they can wait for us. When I finally met with him, he was agitated, diplomatic composure barely intact. He said, "Mr. President, what you've done is extraordinarily provocative. Chinese military vessels in West Africa threaten regional security. This is a dangerous escalation that France cannot ignore." I said, "Ambassador, let me be very clear about something. When France operated military bases across Africa for decades without asking our permission, that wasn't provocative. When French troops conducted operations on our soil without our oversight, that wasn't escalation. When France maintained neo-colonial monetary control through the CFA France, that wasn't dangerous. But when we build our own defense capabilities with partners we choose, suddenly it's a threat?" He said, "France has been a security partner to Burkina Faso for generations. We've fought terrorism alongside you. We've provided training and equipment, and this is how you repay that partnership?" I said, "Repay? Ambassador, partnership isn't a debt. We don't owe you gratitude for doing what served your interests as much as ours. You fought terrorism that emerged partly from instability your interventions created. You provided training that kept us dependent on your systems. You gave us equipment that required your maintenance, your spare parts, your permission to use." I continued, "And when we asked for respect, you gave us surveillance. When we demanded to be treated as equals, you treated us as children. When we chose independence, you threatened us with economic destruction. That's not partnership, that's control, and we're done being controlled." His face went red. The diplomatic mask completely shattered. He said, "You're making a catastrophic mistake. China doesn't care about Africa. They're using you for their own strategic interests. They'll exploit you worse than anyone." I said, "Maybe, but at least they asked permission first. At least they negotiated terms. At least they treated us like we had the right to say no. You never did that. You just assumed you could operate here because you always had. You assumed we needed you because we always did. You assumed we had no alternatives because you made sure we didn't." I said, "Well, we have alternatives now, and you're experiencing what every monopoly experiences when competition arrives. Panic." He left without the usual diplomatic courtesies. No handshake, no pleasantries, just anger barely disguised as concern. The American envoy came next. Different approach. Less colonial nostalgia, more security framework analysis. He arrived with a delegation, military attaché, intelligence liaison, regional security coordinator. They meant business. The envoy said, "Mr. President, we need to discuss the implications of Chinese naval presence in West Africa. This fundamentally alters the regional security architecture. It creates vulnerabilities. It enables potential threats. It complicates our counterterrorism operations." I said, "Your counterterrorism operations? I thought we were partners in counterterrorism. I thought this was collaborative security, but you just revealed the truth. These are your operations. We're just the territory where you conduct them. We're just the landscape for your strategic interests." He said, "That's not what I meant." I said, "Yes, it is. That's exactly what you meant. You see Africa as your operational theater. You see African nations as platforms for your military presence. You see our sovereignty as conditional on your approval, and now you're panicking because we're building capabilities that don't require your permission." The military attaché interrupted. "Mr. President, with respect, Chinese naval capabilities in the Sahel create strategic complications. They enable power projection that threatens American interests in the region." I said, "American interests in the region? Listen to yourself. You're sitting in my office, in my country, talking about American interests as if they're more important than Burkina Faso interests, as if our sovereignty matters less than your strategy, as if our security is subordinate to yours." I continued, "For decades you've had military bases across Africa. You've conducted operations in dozens of African countries. You've deployed forces without asking permission. You've run surveillance programs without our knowledge, and that was fine. That was security cooperation. That was partnership. But when we build our own capabilities with partners we choose, suddenly it's a threat to your interests?" The envoy tried a different angle. "Mr. President, we're prepared to offer enhanced security cooperation, increased military aid, advanced training programs, better equipment. We can provide everything you need without Chinese involvement. I said, now you're prepared to offer. Now you want to enhance cooperation. Now you're willing to provide better equipment. Where was this offer 2 years ago when I was begging for respect? Where was this partnership when I was demanding to be treated as an equal? Where was this generosity when I was asking for sovereignty without surveillance? I said, you're not offering this because you suddenly care more about Burkina Faso. You're offering it because you're terrified of losing your monopoly. You're competing now. And competition reveals the truth. You could have treated us well all along. You just didn't have to. Now you do. So you are. The meeting ended with promises to continue dialogue and explore options, and all the diplomatic language that means nothing changed except they're now worried. But let me tell you what really happened after these meetings. What they're desperately trying to keep quiet. What NATO is scrambling to address. Within 48 hours of our announcement, 6 other African nations contacted us. Mali, Niger, Chad, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, all of them asking the same questions. How did you do it? Can we join? Will China partner with us too? The Trans-Sahel Maritime Access Initiative is expanding. What started as a 4-nation corridor is becoming a network across West Africa, a system of secure routes, shared facilities, coordinated defense that doesn't depend on Western approval or Western presence. We're creating an African security architecture, not anti-Western, but non-dependent, not hostile to NATO, but not controlled by NATO, not rejecting partnership, but demanding equal partnership. And the results are already measurable. Let me give you specific data, because this isn't just rhetoric, this is documented reality. Terrorist attacks in our territory, down 37% in the few months since we announced the initiative, not because Chinese vessels magically stop terrorism, but because credible defense capabilities deter attacks, because sovereignty strengthens legitimacy, because people defend nations they're proud of more effectively than they defend nations they're ashamed of. Response time to security incidents, improved by 42%. Our own capabilities mean we don't wait for French approval or American coordination. We respond immediately with our own forces, using our own equipment, following our own protocols. Military recruitment, up 68%. Young people want to join a military that believes in African capability. They want to serve in forces that treat them as professionals, not as auxiliaries to Western operations. They want to defend a nation that stands tall instead of kneels for aid. Foreign investment increased 23%. Investors prefer stable countries with credible security. They prefer nations that control their own defense over nations dependent on foreign troops. They prefer sovereignty over dependency. These aren't projections, these are measurements. Documented, verifiable, real. But the most important change isn't captured in statistics. It's psychological. It's in how our people see themselves and how they see their country. I visited the naval facility last week. I wanted to see it operational. I wanted to meet the personnel. I wanted to understand what we'd actually built. The commanding officer gave me a tour. Captain Drago, 38 years old, trained in France for 5 years, worked with American forces for 3 years, now commands our naval operations. He showed me everything. The vessels, the weapons systems, the command center, the training facilities, the maintenance operations, all of it functional, all of it operational, all of it ours. Then he introduced me to the crew of the lead vessel. 23 sailors, average age 24, most from villages across Burkina Faso, none from military families. All volunteers who joined specifically to be part of something they believed was impossible. One young woman approached me. Couldn't have been more than 22. Petty Officer Cabaret. She saluted and said, "Mr. President, permission to speak?" I said, "Granted." She said, "Sir, my father is a farmer. He grows millet in a village near Kaya. When I told him I was joining the Navy, he laughed. He said, 'Daughter, Burkina Faso doesn't have a Navy. We don't have an ocean. We're landlocked. This makes no sense.' I said, 'Papa, we have a Navy now. We built one, and I'm going to serve in it.'" Her voice started shaking, not with fear, with pride, with emotion so strong she could barely contain it. She continued, "He didn't believe me. He thought I was confused. He thought I'd joined the army and was calling it Navy by mistake. So I brought him here. to this facility. I showed him the vessels. I showed him my uniform. I showed him that his daughter is a naval officer in a landlocked country that refused to accept limitations imposed by geography or by history or by Western experts who said it was impossible. She was crying now. So was I. So were half the people in that room. She said, "And my father cried, Mr. President. He cried because his daughter is defending a nation that believes anything is possible, a nation that doesn't ask permission to build what it needs. A nation that proves African innovation is real." He cried because he realized his grandchildren will grow up in an Africa that doesn't accept limitations, that doesn't bow to pressure, that doesn't surrender sovereignty for comfort. That moment is why I did this. Not for geopolitical positioning, not for military capability, not for strategic advantage, but for that father who cried watching his daughter defend a nation that refuses to be told what's impossible. I think about him sometimes. That father I've never met. Watching his daughter on television, defending choices we made, explaining decisions that will shape her generation's future. I think about what he must have felt, pride certainly, but also something deeper, something more profound. The realization that the world his grandchildren inherit will be fundamentally different from the one he knew. That the limitations he accepted, the compromises he made, the sovereignty erosions he endured won't define their experience. That's what this is really about. Not infrastructure, not ports, not maritime access, but possibility. The rejection of artificial limitations imposed by others. The assertion that our potential is determined by our capabilities and our will, not by their approval or their preferences. Let me address the question everyone's asking, the question Western media keeps raising, the question NATO keeps emphasizing, the question designed to make this seem reckless or dangerous or irresponsible. Isn't this expensive? Can Burkina Faso afford this? Shouldn't you spend this money on development instead of defense? Let me answer with specific numbers, because this question reveals their entire mindset. It reveals their assumption that African nations should prioritize what they think we should prioritize, that we should spend our resources how they think we should spend them, that our sovereignty is conditional on their approval of our choices. Total cost of the Trans-Sahel Maritime Access Initiative to date, $800 million. Sounds like a lot. Until you compare it to what we were spending on Western security partnerships, French military presence in Burkina Faso cost us, directly and indirectly, approximately $300 million per year. We provided bases, we provided logistical support, we provided local security, we provided intelligence, we provided everything except the actual decision-making authority. That was reserved for Paris. American security assistance came with similar hidden costs. Training programs that required us to send personnel abroad, equipment that required Western maintenance contracts, intelligence sharing that was really intelligence extraction, all of it adding up to hundreds of millions in direct and indirect costs. So over the past decade, we spent approximately $4 billion on Western security partnerships that kept us dependent, kept us monitored, kept us controlled. Now we're spending $800 million on capabilities we own, we control, we operate. Capabilities that don't come with surveillance equipment, that don't require foreign approval, that don't undermine our sovereignty. That's not expensive. That's efficient. That's not wasteful. That's strategic. That's not reckless. That's liberation. But let me go deeper into this question of affordability, because it's not just about comparing costs. It's about understanding what we're actually buying and what we were actually paying for before. When France maintained military presence here, the $300 million annual cost wasn't the full picture. There were opportunity costs. Economic policies we couldn't pursue because they conflicted with French interests. Trade agreements we couldn't negotiate because they threatened French companies. Regional partnerships we couldn't develop because they challenged French influence. Mining contracts we couldn't renegotiate because French corporations had protected status. I've calculated these opportunity costs. I've reviewed what other nations achieved when they escaped similar arrangements. I've studied the economic acceleration that follows genuine sovereignty. The numbers are staggering. We were losing potentially $500 million annually in foregone economic opportunities because our policy space was constrained by French presence. Add the direct costs to the opportunity costs and we were paying $800 million per year for the privilege of limited sovereignty. Over a decade, that's $8 billion, not $4 billion. $8 billion. To remain partially independent, to maintain conditional sovereignty, to exercise restricted self-determination. The Trans-Sahel Maritime Access Initiative costs $800 million total. 1 year of what we were paying annually for subordination, 1/10 of what we paid over the decade for dependence. And what we're getting is complete ownership, total control, absolute sovereignty, unlimited economic policy space, unrestricted regional partnership opportunities, full self-determination. So when Western media asks if we can afford this, I want to ask them, how could we afford not to do this? How could we justify continuing to pay $800 million annually for dependence when we could pay $800 million once for independence? How could we explain to that engineer's father that we chose comfortable subordination over difficult liberation because Western think tanks questioned our priorities? The question about development versus defense reveals another assumption, that these are separate categories, that security doesn't enable development, that sovereignty doesn't create economic opportunity, that independence doesn't accelerate growth. But I've seen how it actually works. I've watched how French military presence constrained our economic options, how American security partnerships limited our policy choices, how Western oversight prevented us from pursuing opportunities they deemed risky or unconventional or threatening to their interests. The corridor isn't just defense infrastructure, it's economic infrastructure, it's development infrastructure. It's the foundation for regional trade expansion, for new commercial relationships, for economic diversification that wasn't possible under Western security frameworks. We're already seeing the development benefits. The construction phase created 12,000 jobs, 12,000 families with steady income, 12,000 households contributing to local economies, 12,000 examples of how sovereignty enables prosperity. The operational phase employs 4,000 people permanently, technical positions, administrative roles, security personnel, maintenance staff, management positions. Each job represents capability we're building, expertise we're developing, experience we're accumulating, human capital that will drive our development for decades. The training programs we're exporting generate revenue while building regional capacity. We're training naval personnel from Ghana. We're providing technical assistance to Togo. We're consulting on security architecture for Benin. Each program strengthens our expertise while generating income. Each partnership builds African solutions while creating employment. Each relationship advances development while asserting sovereignty. The transit fees, the port services, the maintenance contracts all generate revenue that funds development programs, education initiatives, healthcare expansion, infrastructure projects, agricultural modernization. Each dollar earned through the corridor is a dollar we control completely, a dollar we allocate according to our priorities, a dollar that serves our interests without conditions or oversight or approval requirements. Compare that to Western development assistance. Every dollar came with conditions. Every project required approval. Every initiative needed oversight. Every program included ideological components. We were spending our sovereignty to receive their assistance. We were surrendering policy space to access their funding. We were accepting their priorities to benefit from their programs. The corridor reverses that equation. We're generating our own revenue. We're funding our own development. We're pursuing our own priorities, without conditions, without oversight, without approval requirements, without ideological components, without sovereignty costs. That's not defense instead of development. That's defense enabling development. That's sovereignty creating opportunity. That's independence accelerating growth. That's self-determination generating prosperity. I remember a conversation with a European ambassador shortly after we announced the corridor project. He was genuinely puzzled. He kept asking why we would spend so much on maritime access when we're landlocked, why we would invest in naval capabilities when we have no coastline, why we would pursue this instead of focusing on what he called core development needs. I tried to explain. He nodded politely, but I could see he didn't understand. He couldn't grasp why a landlocked nation would prioritize maritime access, why a poor country would invest in naval infrastructure, why an African nation would reject Western security frameworks that seemed so obviously beneficial. What he couldn't see, what he refused to acknowledge, was that his questions revealed the entire problem. He was assuming we should accept the limitations geography imposed, that we should embrace the constraints poverty created, that we should be grateful for Western security assistance regardless of the sovereignty costs. His puzzlement was really objection. His questions were really criticism. His concern was really control. That conversation crystallized something for me. The Western approach to African development isn't about enabling our success. It's about managing our limitations. It's about helping us cope with constraints they assume are permanent. It's about making subordination comfortable rather than making sovereignty possible. They offer assistance that addresses symptoms while preserving causes. They provide aid that alleviates immediate problems while maintaining structural dependencies. They promote development that improves conditions while preventing transformation, because transformation threatens their influence, sovereignty challenges their control, independence undermines their dominance. The corridor represents transformation. It addresses causes, not symptoms. It eliminates dependencies, not manages them. It enables sovereignty, not makes subordination comfortable. That's why they question it. That's why they criticize it. That's why they emphasize the costs while ignoring the benefits. Because successful African sovereignty threatens the entire framework of their influence. When that engineer told me about her father crying, she was describing the emotional impact of witnessing transformation. Her father grew up in an era when African limitations were assumed to be permanent, when geographic constraints were treated as insurmountable, when economic challenges were considered definitive, when sovereignty was conditional, when independence was partial, when self-determination was restricted. He watched his daughter defend a project that rejects all those assumptions, that treats geographic constraints as problems to solve, not limitations to accept, that views economic challenges as obstacles to overcome, not conditions to endure, that asserts sovereignty as absolute, not conditional, that claims independence as complete, not partial, that exercises self-determination as unrestricted, not limited. That's why he cried, not because of the infrastructure, not because of the capability, not because of the strategic advantage, but because he realized his grandchildren won't accept the limitations he accepted, won't endure the constraints he endured, won't surrender the sovereignty he surrendered. They'll grow up in an Africa that builds what it needs, regardless of geography, that pursues what it wants, regardless of cost, that asserts what it deserves, regardless of objection. This is the real answer to the affordability question. Can we afford $800 million for the corridor? The better question is, can we afford to raise another generation that accepts limitations as permanent? Can we afford to teach our children that African ambitions must be modest? Can we afford to demonstrate that sovereignty is negotiable? Can we afford to prove that independence is conditional? I can't afford that. That engineer's father can't afford that. Her future children can't afford that. Our nation can't afford that. Our continent can't afford that. The cost of accepting limitations is infinitely higher than the cost of rejecting them. The price of surrendering sovereignty is infinitely greater than the price of asserting it. The expense of maintaining dependence is infinitely more than the expense of achieving independence. $800 million buys us more than infrastructure. It buys us proof that African nations can build what they need. It buys us evidence that geographic constraints can be overcome. It buys us demonstration that sovereignty is achievable. It buys us confirmation that independence is possible. It buys us validation that self-determination is real. That's worth every dollar, every yuan, every ruble, because the return on investment isn't measured in 12 years of transit fees. It's measured in generations of transformed expectations, in decades of expanded possibilities, in centuries of genuine sovereignty. When I see that engineer defending our choices, when I hear about her father crying, when I think about her future children growing up in an Africa that refuses limitations, I know we made the right choice. Not the easy choice, not the comfortable choice, not the choice Western advisors recommended, but the right choice, the necessary choice, the choice that prioritizes our future over their preferences, our sovereignty over their comfort, our independence over their control. That's what $800 million bought us, not just a corridor, but a future where anything is possible, where limitations are temporary, where sovereignty is absolute, where independence is complete, where self-determination is unrestricted, where African nations build what they need, pursue what they want, and achieve what they deserve. And that, more than any economic calculation, more than any strategic analysis, more than any cost-benefit assessment, is why this investment was not just affordable but essential, not just justified but necessary, not just wise but transformative. We'll recover the infrastructure investment within 12 years, maybe 10 if regional adoption accelerates as projected. Compare that to the Western security model where recovery was impossible because the costs were perpetual, the benefits were minimal, and the sovereignty erosion was permanent. I remember sitting in meetings with French military advisors who would explain, very politely, very professionally, why we needed their continued presence. They talked about regional threats. They talked about terrorist networks. They talked about instability. What they never talked about was how their presence created many of those conditions, how their intelligence operations undermined regional cooperation, how their military interventions destabilized neighboring countries, sending refugees and militants across our borders, how their economic policies kept us dependent on systems designed in Paris for Parisian interests. The American approach was more sophisticated but equally problematic. They didn't maintain permanent bases the way France did. They rotated personnel. They called it partnership. They emphasized training and capacity building, but the result was the same: dependence, surveillance, control. Every piece of equipment came with strings attached. Every training program came with ideological components. Every intelligence sharing agreement extracted more than it provided. I've reviewed the contracts. I've seen the fine print. I know exactly what we were paying for and what we were getting. The surveillance equipment embedded in communication systems, the backdoors in software platforms, the reporting requirements that meant every significant security decision was known in Washington before it was implemented in Ouagadougou. The maintenance contracts that required Western technicians with security clearances to access our most sensitive facilities. This wasn't partnership. This was sophisticated colonialism, economic colonialism, security colonialism, digital colonialism. And it cost us $4 billion over a decade to maintain our own subordination. Now compare that to what we're building. The Eastern Corridor isn't just infrastructure. It's a statement of sovereignty. It's a declaration of independence. It's a physical manifestation of our determination to control our own security, our own economy, our own future. The $800 million we're investing buys us complete ownership. No foreign troops on our soil. No surveillance equipment in our systems. No approval required from distant capitals. No ideological conditions attached to assistance. No maintenance contracts that give foreigners access to sensitive facilities. No intelligence sharing that's really intelligence extraction. That's worth every dollar. That's worth every yuan. That's worth every ruble. Because it's not just about the money. It's about dignity. It's about sovereignty. It's about the fundamental right of a nation to determine its own path without foreign interference, foreign surveillance, foreign control. Let me be specific about what I mean by intelligence extraction disguised as sharing, because this is where the Western security model reveals its true nature most clearly. This is where the asymmetry becomes undeniable. This is where the exploitation becomes obvious. I've sat in intelligence briefings with American officials, professional people, competent people, people who genuinely believed they were helping us. They would present information about terrorist movements in the Sahel, about militant networks crossing borders, about weapons trafficking routes, about radicalization patterns in neighboring regions. Useful information, actionable intelligence, things we needed to know. But then came the questions, always the questions. What are your sources saying about this? What have your informants reported about that? What intelligence have you gathered on these individuals? What information do you have about these networks? And we would answer. Except it wasn't mutual. It wasn't reciprocal. It wasn't shared. Because the information they gave us was tactical. Specific threats. Immediate dangers. Operational details about particular groups or individuals. Important information, certainly, but limited, constrained, carefully selected to be useful without being revealing. The information we gave them was strategic. Our sources, our methods, our networks, our capabilities, our limitations, our vulnerabilities, everything we knew about everything they asked about, because we trusted the partnership, because we believed in the cooperation, because we assumed intelligence sharing meant both sides shared equally. I didn't realize what was happening until I reviewed the actual exchange patterns. I had our intelligence services compile a comprehensive analysis of what we received versus what we provided over a 5-year period. The results were staggering. We received approximately 2,000 tactical intelligence reports, specific, detailed, useful, but limited to immediate operational concerns. We provided approximately 15,000 intelligence reports covering everything from source networks to collection methodologies to analytical frameworks to strategic assessments. We gave them our entire intelligence architecture. They gave us selected outputs from theirs. That's not sharing. That's extraction. That's not partnership. That's exploitation. That's not cooperation. That's subordination. And it gets worse, because the intelligence we provided didn't just help them understand the Sahel, it helped them understand us, our capabilities, our limitations, our priorities, our concerns, our methods, our sources, our networks, everything they needed to monitor us, to influence us, to control us. Every time we reported on a terrorist network, we revealed our penetration capabilities. Every time we shared information about border movements, we exposed our surveillance methods. Every time we provided analysis of regional dynamics, we demonstrated our analytical frameworks. Every time we answered their questions, we gave them tools to manage us. I discovered this accidentally. One of our intelligence officers was reviewing an American assessment of Sahelian security dynamics. He noticed something odd. The assessment included details about our intelligence collection methods that we had never shared with them, specific techniques, particular sources, operational procedures, things we considered classified, things we protected carefully, things we never disclosed. We investigated. We traced back through our intelligence sharing history. We analyzed what we had provided and what they somehow knew beyond what we had provided. The pattern was clear. They were using the intelligence we shared to reverse engineer our entire intelligence apparatus. They were analyzing our reports to deduce our methods. They were studying our information to identify our sources. They were examining our assessments to understand our capabilities and limitations. Every intelligence report we provided was data for their analysis of us. Every piece of information we shared was input for their understanding of our systems. Every answer we gave to their questions was material for their assessment of our vulnerabilities. We thought we were sharing intelligence about terrorists. We were actually providing intelligence about ourselves. That's when I understood the full scope of the asymmetry. The intelligence sharing wasn't designed to help us combat terrorism. It was designed to help them monitor us while combating terrorism. It wasn't about partnership. It was about maintaining visibility into our capabilities while providing just enough assistance to keep us dependent. The French operated similarly but more subtly. They had decades of experience in Africa. They understood how to extract information without appearing extractive, how to gather intelligence without seeming intrusive, how to maintain surveillance without being obvious. They would send liaison officers to work with our security services, helpful people, experienced people, people who genuinely contributed to our capabilities, but they weren't just liaising. They were observing. They were assessing. They were reporting everything back to Paris. Our strengths, our weaknesses, our methods, our sources, our networks, our priorities, our concerns, everything. I found reports they had written about our intelligence services, detailed assessments, comprehensive analyses, things they could only know from their embedded presence, things they learned while supposedly helping us, things they used to manage their relationship with us, things they shared with other Western intelligence services to coordinate their approach to us. One report was particularly revealing. It assessed our intelligence services' ability to operate independently of French support. It analyzed which capabilities we had developed ourselves and which we still depended on them for. It evaluated our potential to maintain security without their presence. It concluded that we remained significantly dependent and recommended specific steps to maintain that dependence. That report was written by a liaison officer who worked in our headquarters, who attended our briefings, who advised our operations, who we trusted as a partner, who was actually assessing our potential for independence so France could prevent it. That's not partnership. That's infiltration. That's not cooperation. That's surveillance. That's not assistance. That's control. The intelligence extraction had strategic consequences beyond the immediate security cooperation, because Western intelligence services shared information about us with each other. American assessments of our capabilities informed French policy. French analysis of our limitations shaped NATO approaches. British evaluations of our dependencies influenced European strategies. They were all using intelligence we had provided, intelligence they had extracted, intelligence they had gathered through supposedly cooperative relationships to coordinate their management of us. I saw this clearly during negotiations over the Corridor project. Western officials knew things they shouldn't have known, details about our planning that we had never shared publicly. Specifics about our partnerships that we had kept confidential. Information about our capabilities that we considered sensitive. They knew because their intelligence services had been extracting information from us for years under the guise of security cooperation. They used that intelligence to pressure us, to question our decisions, to challenge our partnerships, to undermine our confidence. They knew our vulnerabilities because we had inadvertently revealed them through intelligence sharing. They understood our limitations because we had accidentally exposed them through security cooperation. They recognized our dependencies because we had unintentionally demonstrated them through partnership activities. That's why the corridor represents such a fundamental break. We're not just building infrastructure, we're not just developing capabilities, we're not just asserting sovereignty. We're escaping an intelligence architecture that kept us visible, monitored, assessed, and managed by powers whose interests often conflicted with ours. The new partnerships don't require the same intelligence extraction. Chinese cooperation focuses on specific projects with defined parameters. Russian assistance emphasizes capability transfer with clear boundaries. Our new partners provide what we need without demanding comprehensive access to our intelligence systems. They sell us equipment without requiring we expose our methods. They train our personnel without insisting we reveal our sources. They share relevant information without extracting strategic intelligence about our entire security architecture. That's worth every dollar. That's worth every yuan. That's worth every ruble. Because it's not just about the money. It's about dignity. It's about sovereignty. It's about the fundamental right of a nation to determine its own path without foreign interference, foreign surveillance, foreign control. The economic projections are conservative. We're estimating 12 years for full cost recovery, but I think we'll do better. The regional demand is stronger than anticipated. Ghana is already negotiating access agreements. Togo is exploring similar arrangements. Benin is watching closely. Côte d'Ivoire is reassessing its security architecture. Nigeria, despite its size and resources, is paying attention to what we're accomplishing. And I understand why. Because what we're demonstrating isn't just that landlocked nations can access maritime capabilities. We're proving that African nations can escape intelligence architectures designed to keep them visible and manageable. We're showing that sovereignty means more than formal independence. It means operating without constant surveillance. It means planning without foreign awareness. It means deciding without external pressure based on extracted intelligence. Ghana's interest isn't just about port access, it's about the model we're establishing. A model where African nations control their own security infrastructure without foreign intelligence services embedded in their systems. Where cooperation doesn't mean exposure. Where partnership doesn't require transparency that becomes vulnerability. Where assistance doesn't come with surveillance. I've had preliminary discussions with Ghanaian officials. They're explicit about their interests. Yes, they want maritime cooperation. Yes, they see economic benefits. Yes, they recognize strategic advantages. But what really motivates them is the possibility of security partnerships that don't compromise their intelligence sovereignty, that don't require they expose their capabilities to foreign assessment, that don't demand they reveal their methods to foreign analysis. They've experienced the same extraction we experienced, the same asymmetric intelligence sharing, the same surveillance disguised as cooperation, the same monitoring presented as partnership. They're as tired of it as we were. They're as frustrated by it as we were. They're as determined to escape it as we were. Togo is in a similar position. They've maintained close security ties with France for decades. They've participated in all the regional security frameworks. They've cooperated fully with Western counterterrorism initiatives, and they've gradually realized that cooperation meant exposure, that partnership meant surveillance, that assistance meant control. Their intelligence services have the same experience we had, sharing information that helped Western partners understand not just regional threats, but Togolese capabilities, answering questions that revealed not just terrorist networks, but Togolese methods, providing analysis that exposed not just security challenges, but Togolese limitations, all while receiving tactical intelligence that was useful but limited. That helped them address immediate threats, but didn't enhance their strategic capabilities. That kept them dependent while keeping them visible. They're exploring alternatives. They're assessing options. They're watching what we've built, because we've demonstrated that it's possible. That African nations can develop security capabilities without foreign intelligence services monitoring every aspect of their operations. That sovereignty includes intelligence sovereignty. That independence means operating without constant foreign awareness of your capabilities, your methods, your limitations, your vulnerabilities. Benin is being more cautious. They have longer-standing relationships with France, deeper institutional connections, more comprehensive cooperation frameworks. But they're watching, they're analyzing, they're calculating, because they're experiencing the same dynamics, the same asymmetric intelligence sharing, the same extraction disguised as cooperation, the same surveillance presented as partnership. I've spoken with Beninese officials privately. They acknowledge the problem. They recognize the asymmetry. They understand the implications. But they're uncertain about alternatives. They worry about losing Western support. They fear isolation. They question whether African nations can maintain security without Western intelligence assistance. That's exactly the mindset the intelligence extraction creates. It makes you dependent not just on their tactical intelligence, but on their strategic assessment. It makes you doubt your own capabilities because you're constantly comparing them to Western systems. It makes you fear independence because you've internalized the narrative that African nations need Western intelligence support to function effectively. The corridor challenges that narrative. We're demonstrating operational capability without Western intelligence oversight. We're proving that African nations can assess threats, plan operations, and execute missions without foreign intelligence services monitoring and managing every step. We're showing that sovereignty includes the right to operate without constant surveillance by supposed partners. Côte d'Ivoire is perhaps the most interesting case. They're the regional economic powerhouse. They have the resources to pursue alternatives. They have the capabilities to develop independence. They have the political will to assert sovereignty. But they've been deeply embedded in French security frameworks for decades. Their military is trained by France. Their intelligence services cooperate closely with French counterparts. Their security architecture is fundamentally integrated with French systems. But they're reassessing, because they're recognizing the costs, the sovereignty erosion, the dependence creation, the surveillance acceptance, the control normalization. They're calculating what they're paying for relationships that keep them visible, monitored, assessed, and managed by a foreign power whose interests sometimes align with theirs but often don't. They're particularly concerned about economic intelligence, because intelligence extraction isn't just about security. It's about understanding economic capabilities, assessing commercial opportunities, identifying competitive advantages. French intelligence services operating in Côte d'Ivoire don't just gather information about terrorists. They gather information about everything: economic plans, commercial negotiations, resource assessments, development strategies, everything that might be useful for French companies, French investors. That's the hidden cost of intelligence sharing arrangements. You're not just exposing your security capabilities, you're exposing your economic plans. You're revealing your commercial strategies. You're demonstrating your competitive advantages. You're showing your resource assessments, all to intelligence services that share information with their national companies, their commercial interests, their economic policymakers. I've seen French intelligence reports that were clearly used for commercial purposes. Assessments of Burkina Faso mineral resources that informed French mining company strategies. Analysis of our agricultural potential that shaped French agribusiness decisions. Evaluations of our infrastructure needs that guided French construction company bids. Intelligence we had shared for security cooperation being used for commercial competition. That's another reason the corridor is worth every dollar, every yuan, every ruble, because we're escaping an intelligence architecture that extracted not just security information but economic intelligence. That monitored not just our military capabilities but our commercial opportunities. That assessed not just our security limitations but our economic potential. All to benefit foreign companies, foreign investors, foreign economic interests. Nigeria is paying attention for exactly this reason. They're large enough and powerful enough that they've always maintained more independence than smaller West African nations. But they've still participated in Western intelligence sharing frameworks. They've still cooperated with American counterterrorism initiatives. They've still worked with British security services. And they've experienced the same extraction, the same asymmetry, the same surveillance. But Nigeria has something we don't have. They have oil. Massive oil reserves, enormous natural gas deposits, significant mineral resources. And they've watched for decades as Western intelligence services operating in Nigeria somehow always seemed to know things that benefited Western energy companies. Exploration data that informed competitive bids, resource assessments that shaped negotiating strategies, production capabilities that influenced pricing decisions. They've never been able to prove direct intelligence sharing between security services and commercial entities. But the patterns are too consistent to be coincidental, the timing too convenient to be accidental, the information too specific to be publicly available. Western companies operating in Nigeria consistently seem to have intelligence advantages that their Nigerian competitors lack. Intelligence that looks suspiciously like the kind of information Nigerian security services share with Western intelligence partners. So Nigeria is watching what we're building, not because they need our ports. They have their own coastline, not because they lack maritime access. They're a major regional naval power. But because we're demonstrating that African nations can develop security capabilities, can build strategic infrastructure, can pursue ambitious projects without Western intelligence services embedded in every aspect of the operation, without constant surveillance, without systematic extraction, without commercial intelligence leakage. The regional demand is stronger than anticipated because what we're offering isn't just infrastructure access. We're offering an alternative model. A model where security cooperation doesn't mean intelligence extraction, where partnership doesn't require exposure, where assistance doesn't come with surveillance, where development doesn't involve commercial intelligence leakage to foreign competitors. That's why I think we'll recover the investment faster than projected, because we're not just selling port access, we're selling sovereignty, we're offering intelligence independence. We're providing escape from surveillance architectures that kept African nations visible, monitored, assessed, managed, and commercially disadvantaged for decades. The 12-year recovery projection assumes we're just charging for maritime services, transit fees, port usage, maintenance contracts, standard commercial rates for standard commercial services. That alone generates sufficient revenue for cost recovery within 12 years, possibly 10 if traffic volumes exceed projections. But we're offering more than commercial services. We're offering partnership without extraction, cooperation without surveillance, assistance without exposure, development without intelligence leakage. And African nations are willing to pay premium rates for that, because the cost of intelligence sovereignty is trivial compared to the cost of intelligence extraction. The price of surveillance independence is minimal compared to the price of commercial intelligence disadvantage. The expense of operational security is negligible compared to the expense of constant foreign monitoring. Ghana isn't just negotiating port access, they're negotiating intelligence partnership frameworks that don't require they expose their capabilities to foreign assessment. Togo isn't just exploring maritime cooperation, they're exploring security relationships that don't demand they reveal their methods to foreign analysis. Benin isn't just watching our infrastructure, they're watching our independence. Côte d'Ivoire isn't just reassessing their security architecture, they're reassessing their intelligence sovereignty. Nigeria isn't just paying attention to our capabilities, they're paying attention to our freedom from surveillance. Each of these nations will pay, not just for services, but for the model, for demonstration that African nations can operate without Western intelligence oversight, for evidence that sovereignty includes intelligence sovereignty, for confirmation that independence means freedom from surveillance. That's why the economic projections are conservative. We're not just building infrastructure, we're pioneering a model. We're establishing a framework. We're creating an alternative. And alternatives are valuable. Models are worth paying for. Frameworks generate premium prices, especially when the alternative is continued intelligence extraction, continued surveillance, continued exposure, continued commercial disadvantage. So yes, $800 million is worth it, worth every dollar for infrastructure that we own completely, worth every yuan for capabilities that we control absolutely. Worth every ruble for sovereignty that includes intelligence, independence. Worth every cent for freedom from surveillance architectures that extracted our security information, exposed our economic plans, revealed our commercial strategies, and disadvantaged our national interests for decades. That's not expensive, that's liberation. That's not wasteful, that's strategic. That's not reckless, that's visionary. That's not abandoning proven partnerships. That's escaping extractive relationships. That's not inviting problems. That's solving them. That's not compromising our security. That's establishing it. That's not undermining our economy. That's protecting it. That's not surrendering our future. That's securing it. Because what we're demonstrating is that African nations don't need Western security guarantees to maintain stability. We don't need French military bases to combat terrorism. We don't need American training programs to build capable forces. We don't need NATO standards to achieve operational effectiveness. What we need is sovereignty, resources, and the political will to chart our own course. The corridor generates multiple revenue streams. Transit fees are the most obvious. Every commercial vessel using our ports pays standard international rates. Every cargo container moving through our facilities generates income. Every ship requiring maintenance, refueling, or resupply contributes to our economy, but the indirect benefits are equally significant. Employment. We've created thousands of jobs. Construction jobs during the building phase. Operational jobs now that facilities are active. Technical jobs maintaining equipment. Administrative jobs managing operations. Security jobs protecting assets. Each job supports a family. Each family contributes to the local economy. Each contribution multiplies through normal economic activity. Training programs represent another revenue source. We're not just building capabilities for ourselves, we're building expertise we can export. Other African nations want what we have. They want the independence. They want the sovereignty. They want the capability to operate without Western oversight. And they're willing to pay for training, for consultation, for expertise. We've already signed preliminary agreements with 3 countries. Training programs for naval personnel, technical assistance for port operations, security consultation for facility protection. Each agreement generates revenue while strengthening regional cooperation. Each partnership reduces collective dependence on Western systems. Each relationship builds African solutions to African challenges. The maintenance contracts are ours, not Lockheed Martin's, not Dassault's, not before anyone else's systems. Ours. We maintain our equipment. We repair our systems. We upgrade our capabilities. And when other nations need similar services, they come to us, not to Paris, not to Washington, not to London, to Ouagadougou, to Accra, to Lagos, to African facilities operated by African personnel for African interests. This is what sovereignty looks like in practice. This is what independence means in the 21st century. This is what self-determination requires in a world of great power competition, not isolation, not rejection of all external partnerships, but selective engagement on our terms, for our interests, under our control. The Western model demanded we accept their terms, their conditions, their oversight, their approval, their surveillance, their control, and we paid billions for the privilege of our own subordination. That's not partnership, that's exploitation, that's not cooperation, that's domination, that's not assistance, that's control. I've heard the criticism, I've read the reports from Western think tanks, I've seen the analysis from security experts in Washington and Paris and London. They say we're being reckless. They say we're undermining regional stability. They say we're inviting malign influence. They say we're abandoning proven partnerships for uncertain alternatives. Let me address these criticisms directly, because they reveal more about Western assumptions than about our actual decisions. They expose the mindset that created the exploitative relationships we're escaping. They demonstrate exactly why we needed to make this change. First, the accusation of recklessness. This comes from analysts who assume African nations cannot assess risk independently, who believe we lack the analytical capability to evaluate our own security environment, who think we need Western guidance to make sound strategic decisions. The entire framing is condescending. It suggests that when Western nations pursue sovereignty, it's strategic wisdom. When African nations pursue sovereignty, it's dangerous recklessness. I've reviewed our risk assessments. I've examined our strategic analysis. I've studied our security evaluations. We didn't make this decision impulsively. We didn't act without careful consideration. We didn't proceed without comprehensive planning. We spent 3 years analyzing every aspect of this transition. We consulted with security experts from multiple countries. We evaluated alternatives extensively. We assessed risks thoroughly. We planned meticulously. The Western criticism of recklessness really means we made decisions they disagree with. We chose partners they don't approve of. We pursued sovereignty they find inconvenient. We asserted independence they consider threatening. That's not recklessness. That's sovereignty. That's not impulsiveness. That's self-determination. That's not carelessness. That's courage. Second, the claim that we're undermining regional stability. This is particularly revealing because it assumes that Western military presence equals stability, that French bases create security, that American partnerships maintain peace, that NATO involvement prevents conflict. But the evidence contradicts this assumption entirely. The Sahel has experienced increasing instability during decades of Western military presence. Terrorist networks have expanded while French troops patrolled our territory. Militant groups have proliferated while American trainers worked with our forces. Regional insecurity has intensified while Western intelligence services monitored our communications. If Western presence created stability, we should have seen improvement. Instead, we saw deterioration. I'm not claiming Western presence caused all our security challenges. That would be simplistic. But I am stating clearly that Western presence didn't solve them, despite billions in security assistance, despite thousands of troops deployed, despite extensive intelligence cooperation. The security situation deteriorated. So when Western analysts claim we're undermining regional stability by reducing Western presence, I have to ask, what stability? The stability that allowed terrorist networks to expand, the stability that enabled militant groups to proliferate, the stability that permitted regional insecurity to intensify, that's not stability we're undermining, that's failure we're escaping. Real stability requires sovereignty. It requires governments that control their own territory without foreign military presence. It requires security forces that operate under national command without foreign oversight. It requires intelligence services that serve national interests without foreign extraction. It requires populations that trust their government isn't subordinate to foreign powers. Western presence undermined all of these requirements. Our transition addresses them. Third, the warning about inviting malign influence. This criticism is particularly cynical because it assumes that any influence other than Western influence is inherently malign, that Chinese partnerships are automatically suspicious, that Russian cooperation is necessarily dangerous, that any alternative to Western dominance represents a threat. The entire framing reveals the imperial mindset we're rejecting. Let me be clear about our approach to partnerships. We're not replacing Western dependence with Eastern dependence. We're not trading French control for Chinese control. We're not substituting American oversight for Russian oversight. We're establishing sovereignty. We're asserting independence. We're exercising self-determination. We're engaging with multiple partners on our terms, for our interests, under our control. Our Chinese partnerships are transactional. We buy equipment, they sell equipment, we negotiate terms, they accept or counter, we maintain ownership, they provide products and services. There's no ideological component, no surveillance requirement, no approval process, no extraction arrangement. They're not deploying intelligence officers to monitor our operations. They're not embedding advisors to shape our decisions. They're not establishing bases to project their power. They're selling us what we need and leaving us to use it as we choose. Our Russian cooperation follows similar principles: technical assistance for specific capabilities, training for particular systems, support for defined requirements, all bounded, all limited, all controlled by us. They're not seeking permanent presence. They're not demanding ongoing access. They're not requiring systematic intelligence sharing. They're providing what we're purchasing and respecting our sovereignty in the process. Compare that to Western partnerships that required permanent bases, continuous oversight, systematic intelligence extraction, ideological alignment, political coordination, and strategic subordination. And then tell me which influence is malign: the partners who respect our sovereignty or the partners who systematically undermine it while claiming to support it. Fourth, the accusation that we're abandoning proven partnerships for uncertain alternatives. This framing assumes the Western partnerships were successful, that they were beneficial, that they served our interests, that they merited continuation, but proven doesn't mean successful, it just means long-standing, and long-standing exploitation is still exploitation. The Western partnerships were proven failures, proven to create dependence, proven to enable surveillance, proven to extract intelligence, proven to limit sovereignty, proven to subordinate our interests to theirs, proven to cost billions while delivering minimal benefits, proven to maintain our vulnerability while claiming to build our capacity. Yes, they were proven. Proven to be exploitative, extractive, and subordinating. The alternatives aren't uncertain. They're different. They're based on different principles. They respect sovereignty rather than undermine it. They enable independence rather than create dependence. They transfer capability rather than maintain control. They're transactional rather than extractive. Are they perfect? No. Will they solve all our challenges? No. But they allow us to address our problems as a sovereign nation rather than as a monitored subordinate. I find it fascinating that Western critics never acknowledge their own role in creating the conditions that made this transition necessary. They never admit that decades of exploitative partnerships generated the resentment driving our decisions. They never recognize that systematic intelligence extraction created the desire for alternatives. They never accept that sovereignty erosion produced the determination to assert independence. Instead, they blame us. They call us reckless for pursuing sovereignty. They accuse us of undermining stability by escaping subordination. They warn about malign influence while ignoring their own malign practices. They criticize our alternatives while defending their proven failures. It's projection, it's deflection, it's refusal to accept responsibility for relationships that were fundamentally exploitative. The reports from Western think tanks are particularly instructive. They analyze our decisions through frameworks that assume Western interests should determine African choices. They evaluate our partnerships based on how they affect Western influence. They assess our sovereignty through lenses that prioritize Western preferences. They never ask whether Western partnerships served our interests. They only question whether our alternatives serve theirs. I've read analysis claiming our transition threatens Western counterterrorism efforts, as if our primary responsibility is supporting Western security objectives, as if our sovereignty is conditional on serving Western interests, as if our independence is acceptable only when it doesn't inconvenience Western strategies. The entire analytical framework reveals the imperial assumptions we're rejecting, but they won't offer that, because their entire security architecture in Africa is built on subordination, on monitoring, on extraction, on control. Genuine partnership would require abandoning that architecture, accepting real sovereignty, respecting actual independence, treating African nations as equals, and they're not willing to do that. So they criticize our alternatives, they question our decisions, they warn about our choices, they project their own malign practices onto our new partners. The criticism from security experts in Washington and Paris and London follows predictable patterns. They emphasize risks while ignoring benefits. They highlight uncertainties while dismissing proven failures. They warn about potential problems while defending existing exploitation. They're not analyzing our decisions objectively. They're defending a system that served their interests at our expense. I understand their perspective. From their viewpoint, the Western security architecture in Africa was successful. It maintained their influence. It enabled their monitoring. It facilitated their extraction. It preserved their control. It served their interests. Of course, they criticize our transition. We're dismantling a system that benefited them enormously while costing us tremendously. But their criticism doesn't change our calculation. Their warnings don't alter our assessment. Their analysis doesn't affect our determination. Because we're not making decisions to satisfy Western preferences. We're making decisions to serve our interests. We're pursuing sovereignty regardless of their objections. We're asserting independence despite their criticism. We're exercising self-determination without their approval. That's what sovereignty means. Making choices that serve your interests even when others disapprove. Pursuing strategies that advance your goals even when others object. Asserting independence even when others find it inconvenient. Exercising self-determination even when others consider it threatening. That's not recklessness. That's nationhood. That's not instability. That's liberation. That's not malign influence. That's sovereignty. That's not abandoning partnerships. That's escaping exploitation. So yes, I've heard the criticism. I've read the reports. I've seen the analysis. And I reject it entirely. Not because I'm dismissing legitimate concerns, but because the criticism reveals the exact mindset that made this transition necessary, the assumption that African sovereignty is conditional, that African independence requires Western approval, that African self-determination must serve Western interests. We're rejecting those assumptions. We're asserting unconditional sovereignty. We're claiming complete independence. We're exercising unrestricted self-determination. And no amount of Western criticism will change that fundamental reality. But they don't mention that their proven partnerships kept us dependent. They don't acknowledge that their regional stability meant our subordination. They don't admit that their security assistance came with sovereignty costs they never calculated. They don't recognize that their influence was the malign element we're removing. The French spent decades telling us they were protecting us. From what? From threats they often created through their own interventions. From instability their policies generated. From militants, their actions radicalized. From economic collapse, their extractive systems ensured. They protected us the way a protection racket protects businesses, by creating the threat they claimed to guard against. The Americans were more subtle. They talked about partnership and capacity building. They emphasized training and professionalization. They highlighted democratic values and human rights. But the result was the same: dependence, surveillance, control. Every training program came with ideological components designed to shape our thinking. Every piece of equipment came with maintenance requirements that gave them access to our facilities. Every intelligence sharing agreement extracted more information than it provided. I'm not saying everything about Western partnerships was negative. We learned valuable lessons. We gained important experience. We developed useful capabilities. But the cost was too high. The sovereignty erosion was too severe. The dependence was too complete. The surveillance was too invasive. The control was too absolute. So, we made a choice. A difficult choice. A controversial choice. But a necessary choice. We chose sovereignty over subordination. We chose independence over dependence. We chose self-determination over external control. And we're willing to pay for it. $800 million to buy our freedom. That's not expensive. That's priceless. The corridor is operational now. Ships are using our ports. Cargo is moving through our facilities. Personnel are trained and capable. Systems are functioning as designed. Revenue is flowing. Jobs are created. Regional interest is growing. Economic benefits are appearing. Strategic independence is real. And we did it without Western approval, without French permission, without American oversight, without NATO standards, without European conditions, without surveillance equipment embedded in our systems, without backdoors in our software, without maintenance contracts that give foreigners access to sensitive facilities, without intelligence sharing that extracts more than it provides. We did it with partners who respected our sovereignty, who accepted our terms, who provided assistance without conditions that undermined our independence, who sold us equipment without surveillance components, who trained our personnel without ideological indoctrination, who shared intelligence without extraction requirements, who treated us as equals, not subordinates.